Hi, and thank you for tuning into Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Will. Will by Will Smith is an autobiography about the rapper and actor that charts his life from a childhood in West Philadelphia to being a Hollywood megastar. The book covers how he got into the emerging scene of hip-hop music and then later went into acting. But there's also a personal story throughout about him, his family, and the experiences that shaped him as a person. It's an unexpectedly candid account of the ups and downs in Smith's life that led to me finishing the book with a different perspective of the man and insightful questions for myself. The three most profound people in his life and his early childhood development were Will's father, his mother, and his grandmother. And so by virtue of that, you get a little bit of a backstory on each of them, but much of the story still centers on their relationship with Will. So prior to reading this book, obviously I had knowledge of Will Smith and a basic understanding, as I came to realize, of his career. I knew of him as a Fresh Prince as far as being a rapper. I wasn't really into rap at that time, like in the early 90s, because I was like very, very young. And that's when he was most active. And early on in his career, like he was more closely associated with DJ Jazzy Jeff. So I really didn't know about him as like a rapper at that point, more like in the late 90s. But I became especially aware of him during his time on the TV show Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. So I was under the impression that I had a pretty good understanding of his career, which to some degree I did, but I realized I had really just a basic understanding of some things. And then my understanding of his career was also skewed by the age I was when he transitioned from being known more for music to being more known for acting. So I listened to the audiobook, right? And so a decent portion of the book is spent on his early childhood where you get to know his parents, his mom, I think, like he calls her mom or something like that. But I remember specifically his dad is called Daddy-O, and you then have his grandmother. These were the people that loomed large in his life. His mother and father had both been previously married, had children, things like that, then got together. They had him. So from both parents, he had an older sister. And then he had this younger brother. So the understanding that I had of Will Smith was like the later years of Will Smith as a rapper and Will Smith as an actor, as this movie star. Not to be dismissive of him, but in comparison to some other rappers, when I became aware of him in the 90s, was around the time that hip-hop was expanding. So hip-hop was kind of changing from like the more party-oriented or the largely party-oriented style of the 80s that was not necessarily clean cut, but more innocent and focused on being braggadocious. This kind of like, arrogant aspect of hip-hop. Into the 90s when things started becoming more street oriented, where gangster rap was kind of moving more to the forefront. So by the time I became aware of Will Smith, really I knew of him more as an actor. I knew he'd been a rapper, but I wasn't fully aware of his career to that degree. I didn't know anything of him in like the 80s. I didn't really know about anything in the 80s. So by the time he got into acting, he had an image that was not necessarily squeaky clean, but he most certainly was not on the level of like Tupac or Biggie Smalls. You just didn't get street dude from Will Smith. He seemed to come from a pretty stable background, and as it turns out that was the reality. He didn't come from like a wealthy family or anything like that, but his family seemed to be pretty comfortable. His dad was hardworking and rather successful, an entrepreneur who provided them with not necessarily a rich lifestyle, but comfortable, where he went to decent schools, they lived in a decent house, so he didn't grow up struggling. If I'm not mistaken, I think like at least in his earlier years, he went to like private school. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think it negates your blackness or anything like that because you didn't grow up with your life being this constant struggle. I'm with Will Smith where it's like, it might sound a bit dismissive, but you might think of him more along the lines of like a bubblegum rapper. And I don't say that to be dismissive or to question his manhood or his blackness or anything along those lines, but just that he wasn't a hardcore rapper in the vein of some of the other rappers that came out in the 90s. His persona was more jokey, a little bit more comedic. Charismatic, certainly, but not like a hardcore street dude. You wouldn't expect violent lyrics or anything like that from him. On a whole, I don't think he uses profanity or anything like that in his music. But in reading his book, I certainly didn't expect for it to be much different, for his background to have been much different. I appreciate that I had a rather simplified view of Will Smith, that sometimes when we don't know a person's backstory, we just have like a surface level understanding of them. We can oversimplify the manner in which we categorize them. We can oversimplify how we see them, or the traits and characteristics that we ascribe to them or that we associate with them. And so I was actually quite surprised when I started off reading the book, right? Actually mostly about his dad, that his father was, to say, not like he was a criminal or anything like that, but from the description of it, the stories that he tells, the experiences that he shares about his father, he touches on this kind of dichotomy, which is that his father was very much committed to their family in the sense that he was always present in their lives. He was always present in the lives of his children, saw to it that they had what they needed. He provided for them in the sense that we think of good fathers, really good parents doing for their children. But in many ways, he failed to protect them as we would think of, or rather, he protected them from outside forces as we would expect a parent to do, and traditionally we'd expect the father to do, but his dad was less capable of protecting his mom and his siblings from himself, where he gave them the physical things that they needed. He saw to their survival. He took care of them and made sure that they had the things that they needed. But at the same time, within their home, his presence also was that of a looming threat of violence, that he was incredibly violent towards Will's mom, towards the kids in general. And this was further exasperated by his drinking. So a lot of Will Smith's childhood, it includes that things that you would expect to hear, regular childhood shenanigans. There's this funny story told about him where he bet his friends that he could dunk, and a freak accident ends up occurring, which results in him getting knocked out and carried off in an ambulance and all this kind of stuff. Just being a kid growing up in West Philadelphia at this time, and then deciding that, in his childhood, this would have been like the 70s, that in West Philadelphia, he's going to take to wearing cowboy boots. He gets this weird bicycle when all the other kids have Huffies. And nothing wrong at all with being different. I think people being different helps make the world a more interesting place but it's it makes for some pretty interesting stories. Just these examples of this kid is a little bit different from the other kids in the neighborhood. Just awkward and sometimes hilarious situations that it brings about. You expect those kinds of stories because when we're kids, we're exploring the world to understand ourselves, develop our sense of self. And so we experiment with things. We don't necessarily have the self-awareness, or rather the self-consciousness, especially when we're very young, to care about what other people think of us or the boxes that we should try to fit ourselves into. Being less self-conscious about ourselves, being less self-aware, kids experiment with things that really it's a matter of them being more authentically themselves because they're still exploring and developing their sense of self. They're less rigid in the things they do or the things that they take interest in. Their sense of identity isn't quite developed as yet. So it's in the process of developing and taking shape. And as part of that, they're not as rigid with regards to things they believe are for or not for them. They don't really have an idea of such and such person, as such and such person, I don't do X thing. If most of us look back over our lives and look at our childhoods, you'll have these little anecdotes, these little experiences, really off the wall kinds of things that you did as kids. But at the same time, what's unexpected is some of the experiences that Will has with his dad. Stories from a very young age, personally experiencing violence at the hands of his father. It could be a matter of generations and perspective on things changing, where in the past, I think it was more socially acceptable for people to physically discipline their children. And even in some instances for men to be in a sense, for lack of a better term, for disagreements with their wives or their significant other, for them to become physical. It's times have changed, and I'd like to think that as we've evolved as people and have a better understanding of how these things shape and impact us as individuals, that we've moved away from those things being our view. I think more people would move away from viewing those actions as being acceptable. what was taking place wasn't like garden variety discipline, right? And I can say with comfort that I don't think there's any circumstances under which it's acceptable for a man or a woman to become physically violent with their significant other, or really to be physically violent with anyone because they're having a disagreement or they have a difference of opinion. And so in listening to the book and hearing Will recount these experiences of loving his father, because in one sense his father showed love and care for him, took care of him, but at the same time that his father was also incredibly physically abusive towards him, towards his mom, towards his siblings. You know, him personally experiencing violence, witnessing his father be violent with his siblings, but then also witnessing his father be just incredibly violent with their mother. He expresses he felt during his childhood where it kind of kept him off kilter, in the sense, like a sense of unease, because this person that shows and expresses in one moment so much love for you, in another moment can become incredibly violent. So it's this thing of constantly walking on eggshells, a sense of unease, because you don't really know who you might be dealing with on any given day. On days when his dad's in a good mood and everything is going right, everything's being done right, he could be loving and doting. But then on days when he might be drinking, or you might do something wrong, as children do, or he's just simply upset for one reason or another, it could mean, in the snap of a finger, incredible violence. So there's this sense of unease, this thing of never really being able to be comfortable around him, like just constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop, or knowing that this is a powder keg, a pressure cooker, where pressure is just building, that every so often it's going to erupt. And so it was something that kind of like caught me off guard, not having any prior knowledge of his childhood. When we think of Will Smith of today, he's this happy, jovial person. You kind of see the development, and he dives into it. This thing of getting into performance. From an early age and dealing with his dad who had a passion for photography, videography, and things like that, this thing of performing for his dad, or putting together these performances with his dad where his father would shoot home movies or take pictures, he learned from an early age that when he performed to his father's standards, or performed in a way that his father showed approval for, it got like positive reinforcement from his dad. Whereas when he did things that his dad didn't approve of, or things that made his father upset, or perform below expectations, it would often mean violence. And so with that, it heavily influenced how he moved through life. It's like in the same way when you speak to like people who go into healthcare or who go into law enforcement or some of these other fields, quite often it's that they had some interest in whatever the field might be. But when you ask them and you look back on it, a lot of times it's that they had some kind of experience as a child that pushed them towards that career path where, maybe they had health issues, or they had a family member that had health issues when they were a kid and they had to go to the doctor or the hospital or whatever. And they had a positive experience with doctors and nurses that made them want to go into healthcare, right? You notice these kinds of influences and how these things play a role in the career paths that people ultimately choose. And so you see that here with Will, where he learns from a young age that when he performs up to his dad's standards, not just within these movies, but just in life in general, performing to his dad's standards brings praise. It kind of helps to keep this monster at bay. And when he underperforms, when he doesn't live up to his dad's expectations, that there's then this threat of violence. And so with that, he ends up going into first music and then acting. But even within his life, within his personal life, outside of work, outside of entertainment, there's still this performative aspect where he learned to do things to perform, but not to necessarily be authentic to himself. To sometimes do things where it's like being a people pleaser, doing things that would bring praise and acceptance from other people, but that aren't necessarily what he wants to do, what he truly believes or feels. And so it's just this thing that you see that starts to take shape and take form during his childhood, but becomes really evident as he gets older, and actually becomes a problem as he gets older. Because this thing with people pleasing, when you're doing things for the satisfaction for others, but they're things that don't necessarily serve you. They're things that don't necessarily make you happy. You're doing these things because you're thinking, if I do it, it'll get me acceptance from the people around me. It will make the people around me happy. But it's not necessarily what you want to do. It's not necessarily what gives you joy or falls in line with what gives you happiness. When you do that over and over, over time, you can find yourself moving far down a path that you really don't have any interest in pursuing. You hear this sometimes with people where they become like lawyers or doctors or something along those lines. It might be someone else's vision for you. You might feel like this is the thing that you should do, only to go down that path because you haven't really taken the time to figure out that this is the thing you shouldn't do, right? It's the smarter, reliable path, the acceptable path, but it's not necessarily the path for you. You're not necessarily taking into consideration what would make you happy, what would make you feel fulfilled. You might be going down this path to satisfy the expectations of a parent, the expectations of your family, your community, something along those lines. And it's fine to take those things into consideration, but if you don't take the time to assess what truly makes you happy, what truly makes you feel fulfilled, you can get to the end of this thing having put in all of this work, all of this effort and energy, and just feel absolutely unhappy. It's like, I don't remember where it was. I think it might have been like an interview with Diddy or something like that, where they were talking about wealth. And I've heard variations of this from other people, where it's like, when you don't have money, money can seem like a solution to a lot of your problems, or the solution to a lot of your problems. And it's like, sure, that's true with regards to problems that money can solve. So if it's like, paying your bills, housing, having a roof over your head, something along those lines. But as far as like the internal things, the emotional things, money isn't going to solve those problems. Money isn't going to give you that fulfillment or fill that hole within you. If your problem is really some sense of emptiness inside, some sense of emotional emptiness or unhappiness within you, money isn't going to solve those problems because that's not a financial issue. That's an emotional or psychological issue that you have to address with those means. People think that if I get money, I'll finally be happy. But the reality is there's a lot of unhappy millionaires out there. It's possible for you to be unhappy as a millionaire. It's possible for you to be unhappy as a billionaire because money in and of itself, it can be used as a tool to take care of financial issues or to address financial problems. But your sense of happiness, your sense of self-worth and fulfillment and all those things, that's more a state of emotional and psychological, mental well-being. Money can only go so far towards helping you to address those needs and concerns. Learning from a very young age will adopt this idea of being a provider, right? This example that's been set by his dad of having this hustle mentality, of being hard driving. It's something that his father instilled in him from a very young age. The sense of discipline and respect for hard work, to always be on your A game, to always be working, to be striving and achieving, doing, pushing for more, for this high level of ambition. But unfortunately, for much of his life, this drive to achieve and to do more to be successful, sure, but there's less assessment about, well, what does assessment look like for you? What's your personal definition of success? What's your personal definition of happiness? What do you need, or what do you need to not have in your life for you to be happy and fulfilled? And it's like, if you're not assessing those things, if you don't have those conversations with yourself, you can find yourself putting in all of this work, effort, and energy and getting to the end of it and feeling absolutely unfulfilled, being unhappy. You put in years, decades really, working towards being successful in your chosen career, amassing all of this money, and just being absolutely miserable, which is what ends up happening here. I don't really want to rehash his whole life story. You read the book to get that. But the thing that I took away from it, not to say that, it was a fad or anything like that before, but honestly, I've always kind of thought of Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith as being kind of weird. To be quite honest, to each his own with regards to how people choose to raise their kids, but I felt like some of their parenting choices, the whole family just seemed to be off. But part of that could just be that we had different experiences and different perspectives on life. But in reading the book, I gained a better understanding of, not to say that I know Will Smith, I don't, right? He's still a stranger to me, but I gained a better understanding of his perspective and his mental approach to things. Gaining a better understanding of his backstory kind of helped to put a lot of stuff you hear about him into perspective. Some of the behaviors and actions that you see from him, his wife, his family, the beliefs that they have, how they move through the world. And that's one of the things I think is really a benefit about reading about other people's life experiences, especially if they live lives that are different from yours. Because when we move through life, the only person whose life story we have a full and thorough understanding of is our own. Even when we look at our parents, our siblings, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and whatnot, they might have existed. Well, definitely your parents and grandparents would have lived lives before you were born. And those experiences that they had, that they would have had that you wouldn't know about, you wouldn't be privy to without them telling you about them. And so it's like, even with things like friends and relatives, we gain a better understanding of them by, learning their life stories, by learning about their experiences. I think that's also true for learning about other cultures or people from other parts of the world. People who are walking their own path, where we know our life story, but in learning the life story of others, I think it makes you more compassionate towards other people. It makes you more open-minded towards other people. And I certainly felt that in reading this book here. Because like I said, it wasn't that I disliked Will Smith or I disliked Jada Pinkett Smith or their kids or anything like that. I just thought they were weird. And honestly, it's not so much that I don't dislike them, but it's just in general, I don't really take much interest in celebrities. But in reading this book, I felt like it helped to humanize Will Smith, because you learn about his childhood experiences. And, certainly I didn't read the book and feel like, we're best friends now. But I felt like you had a better understanding of him as a person, or at least you knew more about him as a person rather than just this image that you see on TV or in movies. It made him feel more human. This is someone whose life experience has been completely different from my own, but yet still there's some shared similarities. Reading about someone from a very different walk of life, whose experiences have been very different from mine, I feel that it's impacted me for the better. I felt like I benefited from that. I was able to learn and pick up on some things, and actually found myself asking myself questions, and then also assessing things from my own life in reading about him and his experiences. Looking at it at first, and this quite often happens where, I'll start an audiobook. In this case, I was like, man, this is like 15 hours or something along those lines. And I was like, it's a long book. I don't know how I'm ever going to get through this. And then you start listening and you get into the story, and before you know it, you're looking at the timeline and it's moving and moving and moving. And it's like, here's this long book, I have to get through it. And then it becomes this thing of, man, I'm really enjoying this book. And now I'm at the halfway point. Now I'm at 75%. Now it's almost over. And so with that, I highly recommend this book, because it's like, sure, you might know the story of Will Smith, like the progression of his career, the path of his career, and how things moved along. But more importantly is the self-exploration that he goes on here. And I was actually pretty surprised by how honest and open he was. Granted, part of my thing with celebrities is that I look at it like, I might like your music, I like your movies and things like that, but I see that as that. And then there's you. If I happen to meet a celebrity, I don't think, we'll be like best friends or something like that simply because I've listened to your music or watched a movie or two of yours. We don't know each other. We're still strangers. I'm aware of you. You most certainly are not aware of me. And so with that, I don't feel a sense of entitlement to know the inner workings or details of a celebrity's life just because they're on like TV or in movies or something like that. I feel like you're still entitled to your privacy. You're entitled to move about freely in the world and not have to worry about me being crazy or something like that, or having this one-sided relationship and feeling like you're then obligated to reciprocate this interest that I might have in you. As part of that, I understand celebrities being private about their inner lives, because I think most of us, right, like I'm private about the details of my personal life. And so as a result of that, I think other people are entitled to privacy as well. Some aspect of their career choice includes being present in the press. And so I understand when celebrities choose to keep some aspects of their life private, because no one's obligated to share everything about themselves. But I was certainly surprised by how honest and open and really vulnerable Will was in sharing his story, because there's some aspects of his story that really don't make him sound all that great, that are actually pretty embarrassing. And I think that's the case with most of us, where we're all human beings and we're not perfect at all times. I do believe that most people are good most of the time. We make mistakes. We don't always do the right thing or make the right choice. But for the most part, I think that people are good. And I think that if we all lived under the microscope as celebrities, yet every move or words being picked apart, we might operate a little bit differently, or we might not be able to live with that degree of scrutiny. And so in listening to the audiobook, I respected his honesty, especially with regards to discussing some of his insecurities. And especially because it's something that so often, because of traditional views on what manhood and masculinity means, it's something that so often, because of traditional views on manhood and masculinity and what that means, you'd be especially surprised about a man sharing something that I didn't even think of or consider, which was him being uncomfortable with his body up until about the time of Bad Boys. I was recently telling a friend about Queer Eye, the show that's now on Netflix, and in watching that show, you see like these makeovers. I'm a woman, so I don't know about the experience of being a man or growing into manhood, but in watching the show, in seeing men talk about their experiences, and they also have insecurities like women, things that they're insecure about with regards to their physical appearance, but because of the expectations or associations with masculinity and manhood, that they don't necessarily feel comfortable sharing those things or sharing those inner feelings, really any feelings, especially those feelings of inadequacy, topics in which they might feel sensitive. So I was actually really impressed. That might not be like the right word, but I can't think of what the proper word would be. But with Will speaking openly about some of these feelings of insecurity, like feeling like a coward for much of his life, which stemmed from this thing from his childhood of being brutalized by his dad, seeing his mother and his siblings being brutalized by his dad and feeling powerless in the moment, feeling like there was nothing he could do, or, being scared when seeing other people being victimized or potentially victimized, having this like fight or flight kind of thing, and his response quite often being to just freeze and not knowing what to do, carrying that with him into his childhood, which was like this feeling of inadequacy, of falling short of being a man because of feeling a natural emotional response like fear. And so I just thought it was a really interesting book, and I highly recommend it. I think it's a great book for young men to read, but actually it's a great book for adult men to read, regardless of age. But it's also a good book for women to read. Not saying that you're going to read it and suddenly have like an understanding of men and things like that, but just because I think we grow as people in better understanding the life experiences of others. And so with that, I think like we get a greater sense of compassion for other people and an ability to understand the experiences of others and to put ourselves into other people's shoes. And so with that, this turned out to be an incredible book. I think that regardless of whatever your walk in life, you can read this book and take something away from it. It's an incredible book. Highly recommend. Can't speak well enough about it. It's definitely a book that I think is certainly given a listen to. And that's my review. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more book recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my book review playlist.